We've got very close very quickly, haven't we?
Yeah. I like that though. You might want to pull that in a little bit.
There we go.
And then I thought you were going to mention this.
I love it.
Sheet in front of the window.
I think you've done really well.
I'm going to have a couple of questions about that, I think, from neighbours.
Oh, yeah.
So what's going on in your house?
Yeah. That's dodgy activity.
Welcome to Not Designed for the Grind, a period reality podcast about women's health, hormones, and the power of understanding your cycle.
I'm Dr. Katerina Banbang, consultant gynecologist and reproductive medicine specialist, and also founder of the Delphi Clinic.
And I'm Marlou, a social entrepreneur and TEDx speaker, and founder of Period Reality and Jive. We bring together science and storytelling to change the way we understand women's health.
Every week, we'll have honest conversations, we'll challenge outdated myths, and we'll bring you fresh perspectives on women's health. Today, we're in the follicular phase. Our energy's building, creativity and possibility are coming back online. The episode is all about space for fresh thinking and new direction.
Let's begin.
Hello.
We're in episode 6.
Episode 6.
And we've launched the podcast.
I know. It doesn't quite feel... It's strange, isn't it? When you say launch, you feel like something is physically going to happen in your day-to-day life, but nothing actually changes. You're like, okay, it's launched.
Okay, yeah. Now people are apparently
are
listening.
able to see it. Yeah.
It was good though. I like that we got to spend the day together. I think if we hadn't been together,
that was probably the best bit. That was
it would have
really
maybe
great.
Just been like any other Sunday. Well, it was International Women's Day, but I think the fact that we got to make a little day out of it was nice.
Yeah, I think that was great. It was a really good day.
And the feedback has been great as well, to be honest.
Yeah, and actually I don't know how, I mean, it's my first time doing a podcast, so I don't know what I expected.
Yeah, okay.
But I was surprised that I got feedback quite so early. So yeah, what feedback did you get?
Well, I want to do a shout out to our number one fan, Micah, because she's left a comment on both the first 2 episodes we launched on Spotify.
Oh, that's fantastic.
So that was great. I mean, she also sent me basically a podcast as a voice note with like her thoughts and the stuff that resonated and things like that. But that public support means a lot as well, right?
Yeah,
so,
completely.
I was like, yeah, go on, girl. Like,
yeah, that really means a lot, because actually it's a daunting thing to do, isn't it? I think we've both kind of talked about our journeys to kind of, getting there, to doing it and getting out there. So the feedback does mean a lot. And, I've had feedback to say, that they're really enjoying it and that actually they're learning things that they've never thought about in their life. And I thought that was brilliant.
I've had people say they want you as a doctor.
Oh,
and
that's
I get
so
that.
kind.
Yeah,
That's really lovely.
Like, I think that's what we hope this would be, right? Like, I think, well, maybe your goal wasn't to show people what a great doctor you are, which you are. But I mean, just in terms of my intention here was to really demonstrate that it doesn't have to be that daunting and that step of like seeking medical professional help, raising your concerns. We've talked about that a lot in previous episodes. And it's like, doctors are people too.
Yeah, no, completely. Do you know what? My intention really is, it's to say exactly that actually it's meant to be a relationship between you and your doctor. And it's not meant to be one-sided. It's not meant to be you building your strength to fight for your, for your voice to be heard. It's meant to be a relationship together. And the other feedback I've had is about our dynamic, and that actually, we work really well together. And I would say, I mean, that was always going to be easy because we're friends. So no, it's
I agree with that. And one of the things I've also heard.
Yes.
I forgot what I was going to say.
I had to pause there. I was thinking, okay, this is
I'm
going to be a big one.
building up the tension. What did I hear?
I don't know. Was it related to, what was it related to? Feedback.
Oh, one of the things I also heard was someone saying that they really appreciated that I said out loud that I felt really dumb when I first learned about the 4 phases of the cycle and, about all this stuff.
Yeah.
And that really resonated. And I think we talked about that in an earlier episode of like the gap between if you're totally new to this and then when you go and try and find information on the internet, you might already feel like you're starting way behind.
Yeah.
And people, it's really hard to kind of, that's how I felt of like meeting people where they're at.
Yeah, completely.
And, I stand by that. Like, and I still, feel.
Well,
maybe dumb isn't the right.
Yeah,
but like,
it's not the right
stupid.
word.
Then
Well, what I'll
my
do
body.
though,
Why don't I know
but
these
I would
things?
challenge you with why would you know it? If
No,
someone
no.
doesn't tell you,
Yeah.
why would you know it? And it was really interesting because one of my friends who, and we were having this conversation yesterday, and she said she really enjoyed it, and she said, and she said something similar in that she's like, I just felt like I'm ridiculous that at 45 I don't know these things. And I said, but why would you? And then she said to me, actually, you're right. You got your period when you were 12. Nobody talked about it. Your mom handed you some pads, and that was that. She told you you're going to need these once a month. Off you go. And she said that was it. No one talked about it at school. We had half an hour and it was all very awkward. And then it was never raised again.
Yeah.
And so then I said, well, exactly. So why would you know these things?
Yeah. Which is why.
So yeah,
that's why
we're here. Exactly.
That's why we're doing this. And I think it ties in quite nicely with what we're going to be talking about today as well, because we're in our follicular phase. Are you aligned this month?
No, I'm not aligned.
This week?
Sorry.
No, I'm not either.
No.
We're going to fake it. We had that. Make it.
Yeah, exactly. We had a good run for the first 4 episodes.
We had a good run.
That's it.
So today's episode is going to be a lot about storytelling.
Yeah. And I'm
culture.
looking forward to this because actually, I would be the first to say that there's so many stories out there that I'm just not aware of. And you shared something, was it the last episode, about farmers in India. And I just thought that was so fascinating. And I thought, gosh, I'd never thought of that before. And it was just a reminder of the privilege that I live in, of kind of thinking about the stories in my environment, but not beyond. So yes, I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, and I think it was a huge part of why I started Period Reality. And I think actually why it's called Period Reality, right? We talk a lot about how people's realities are so different. And there's not a one solution fits all. That's not the phrase, is it?
Yeah, no,
one
there isn't one solution for all.
Fits
Single
all.
size fits all. Yeah.
There simply isn't. And my frustration was when I started to really look into the menstrual cycle as a whole and the 4 phases, it was a lot of what I found. I didn't find a lot, actually. The small bits that I found came from either North America or Northern Europe. And it was written in a very Western way. So it talked a lot about, it refers to the 4 phases as the 4 seasons, which doesn't translate geographically. Like we talked about that before, like a summer here is different than a summer somewhere else. But also...
And if you don't have 4 seasons, like half equatorial Africa is rainy season and dry season.
And maybe people can then still relate to it, but it just felt like it's not for them, And I think that level of like inclusion was really important for me, because then the other thing is that a lot of the language used was around trying to reframe the narrative around this topic being like negative and taboo and secret. So it's almost moving it to the toxic positivity side, where it's saying your cycle is your superpower, your period is your superpower, you should embrace it. And I've always felt, and because of my previous work, and I used to be the CEO of an international charity. We worked with mostly young people, but from every single country in the world. And I knew a lot of stories about people's realities, and it just didn't align. And if you can't go to school, or if we're going to talk about a couple of stories today as well, and that is your reality, to then come across information where it says your period is your superpower, you're not going to feel that
you're not going to resonate with that, are you? You're not. Yeah, there's a real dissonance.
To be honest.
Yeah.
And then I thought, actually, knowing and understanding your body, and I feel like a broken record because I say this on repeat, but knowing and understanding your body is a basic human right, and it's for everyone. And I'm hyper aware that I'm still based in Northern Europe, and that I'm still a very privileged white woman doing this work. But bringing in these stories and creating a platform and a community to showcase these stories, because like you said, so often it's also that people just have never thought of other people's realities, right? But in doing that and in sharing those stories, we actually create these openings for conversation and education as well. And that's what I'm incredibly passionate about. So,
but I agree, but I think it doesn't have to be one or the other, because actually in creating awareness within your own environment, yes, we're like you say, we're privileged. We're in Northern Europe, where we can, talk about all of those things, create that awareness, and we have space to change our environment. But actually starting to create that and making that the baseline then means that we can see all over the world where those gaps are.
Yeah.
And actually we can then invite spaces to say, right, well, what needs to change for you in your environment for you to have that baseline? And what does it need to look like for you? And allow people to then be the architects of their own environmental change. But if we never talk about it, then we'll never change it in any environment almost,
I
isn't
fully
it? So
agree.
yeah.
And you see that in a lot of like our partnerships and the programs we do with people from all different places in the world, is that it's, it has to be hyper localized, because it's not even in people who live on the other side of the world, right? Like even in your own communities, that can be very opposite and different realities. And it has to be super localized to people's real reality. So I'm actually, for this one, I'm going to use my phone, which probably wouldn't be so bad if we weren't also recording this. So I'm making that as a side note. Normally we're not scripted and we're just having conversations without any notes. But today I wanted to bring it because I think it's fair to say that what we're hoping for this podcast is that people also start submitting their stories, and we can weave them into these episodes, because at some point we're going to run out of stories ourselves.
And not just that. I mean, I'm not sure I'd run out of stories. I have seen many patients over the last 22 years.
Fair enough.
I have many stories to tell, but well, they're not my stories, but they're their stories to tell. But I think more importantly is it's just getting that message across as well, I guess, that this isn't our podcast for us, that it's our podcast for all those women out there who have a story to tell that may not have been heard, and so that's why, I absolutely invite people to send in their stories.
Yeah, we haven't had that so far. Obviously, we've only launched about a week ago. So the stories that I'm going to try and weave in for today are stories that we've collected over the years, and I want to make sure I do them justice as well. So I'll be looking at my phone every now and then to be like, I want to make sure I'm saying the right thing and I'm honoring these stories. But I'd like to start by talking about how menstruation is obviously a biological process, and kind of unpicking how much of our experience of the menstrual cycle is cultural, though, and how culture influences how we experience our cycle. Because I think, so much of that starts with a story. And we talked about before about how your normal is your mom's normal is your grandmother's normal. And that in itself is a story, right? A story transmitted through generations. And I think for a lot of people, the story they carry around their own menstrual cycle and their own experience is what they carry within their body. And that's what they carry with them.
That's interesting. Yeah.
And for some, that story is shame. For some, it might be celebration. For some, it might be traumatic. For some, it might be. But I think a lot of it, centers around sometimes the first story, whether it's the first story you heard or the first experience you had. So I thought today we're going to look a little bit about how that intersection between biology and culture, and about how your personal experiences influence your story and the story that you carry with you. So I want to start by talking a little bit about dignity, because when we talk about cycle awareness, sometimes I have conversations about people saying, if you take the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the bottom most foundational need that we all have is, your food, your shelter, what we need for survival, and dignity being one of them. So in a world and in communities where people cannot menstruate with dignity, and, that can be for many reasons, where does cycle awareness fit in? Can we go into communities to talk to them about cycle awareness when actually people don't have access to period products?
Yeah.
And I thought a lot about, this was a huge theme for me in the first year when we actually tried to figure out what can period reality be, what niche are we trying to fill here? And I think, I find it important to just put it out there that we're not arguing that those basic needs need to be met, first and foremost, but just in general.
Yeah.
And I think dignity can show up in very different ways, right? So, something that I shared here is if you cannot manage your period safely or privately, it affects everything: education, work, mobility, your confidence, whatnot. And there was a story from a girl in Nepal, and she was sharing how actually within her culture, the time of the month where you're bleeding, it's being seen as impure. So you're actually being removed from your family and from your community. And that can look different depending on where you are, but it could mean that you're in a small hut or an animal shed, but you're just not supposed to be interacting with other members of your family.
And I had seen that that's been made illegal technically, but actually is still happening. And that there's lots of women that are still experiencing that, even though it's meant to be outlawed.
It has been outlawed in Nepal, at least, which I did confirm when looking through this story. But also on top of that experience on a monthly basis, it's also very dangerous because there's a lot of stories of women who've passed away because of, for example, smoke inhalation when it's very cold, so they try to light a fire to keep themselves warm, and then they pass away. So there was a story that came out in 2019 about a woman called Amba Bohara, and she died together with her 2 children after lighting a fire in a small menstrual hut to keep warm, and they suffocated overnight due to smoke inhalation. But there's other reports saying girls dying from snake bites, cold exposure, again, like smoke inhalation, whilst sleeping in these huts. So I think it's just to also put it out there to understand how deeply these stories about menstruation shape women's lives.
Yeah. And you know what? That's devastating. That is devastating. And I feel like we've got a duty, right? Because we stand on the shoulders of giants in terms of the women that came before us. That, sorry, I don't know why I'm getting emotional, but we really do. And we're here with the rights and privileges that we have today because women fought hard for us to have those. And so the thought of how many women around the world are still living in those conditions is just devastating. It's devastating, and it's not okay. And I think, and that's why it's almost our job, right? It's almost our duty in everything that we do. I mean, you don't have to be, a health professional. You don't have to be starting a charity, just in your day to day, even just that appreciation of the privilege of having a cycle and knowing that no one's going to banish you to a hut for a week where you might die. I mean, it sounds so far removed, but that's someone's monthly reality. Yeah, that's heavy. That is really heavy.
We often say that, isn't it? Like, with great privilege comes great responsibility.
Absolutely. And what we pass on to our children as well, right? Because the other thing is we are probably that cusp generation. We're probably that cusp generation for many things, but we're that cusp generation that still has close enough contact to understanding women's rights in terms of the women that fought for us to get the vote, the women that fought for us to be in the workplace, to own our own property, all of those things. So I think it's close enough, but, the next generation beyond, the children who are, kind of becoming teenagers now, that's going to be a really far removed reality for them because
growing up here in the
UK. Yeah, absolutely. Because they'll sort of think, well, of course you've got jobs. Of course you can buy property. So those stories of, women, this story that you just shared will sound so much more, even more alien than it sounds to us. Yeah, and to us. So yeah, we absolutely have a duty to even share those stories, to make them known.
Yeah. Because I think, when we talk about dignity and basic human rights as well, like, if we all menstruated with dignity, what would that look like? Because I like what you just said about it's hard for the upcoming generation to even imagine what it was like for women that they couldn't own property here in the UK. We want the next generation. We want it for them to be impossible to think that women would be excluded of anything because of their menstrual cycle, right? So what would that take?
What would that take? I think first of all an awareness, right? And it goes back to what we were talking about, awareness. And there's so many layers. There's so many layers to think about, because it's awareness of who you are and where you sit in your environment. And what does menstruating with dignity mean for you?
Yeah.
Because actually we say menstruating with dignity, but we talked last week about, women having heavy periods and having a flooding episode in the workplace. And, that's not an experience that allows dignity when you haven't been able to share that, when you don't feel safe in the workplace to say, look, this is what's happening to me. So there's lots of layers. So then to empower that woman and empower the workplace to support her, then means that she now knows what that experience is. And so hearing these stories and publicizing stories of what is it like for other women elsewhere in the world, well, then she can take that dignity and say, well, no, actually, I want all those women to have that.
And I think everyone with a menstrual cycle has had a moment where they didn't feel that dignity, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
absolutely.
I don't want to generalize here, but it's hard for me to imagine that.
Yeah, I don't think
someone has never been, either surprised with their period or didn't bring products or leak through their whatever. And it's like, so to a certain level, you're right. We can all relate a little bit to that feeling of not being in control of your own dignity.
Exactly. And so if you create that environment of, well, what does that look like where I have control of my own dignity? And then you wish that for everyone, right? And that's, I suppose, that same thing of when we realized how much, what it is to have food on the table, and actually that we would want that for everyone, to be able to bring food to the table. And so it's almost creating that, going back to Maslow's hierarchy, it's almost creating that same concept of saying, well, surely if we want food on the table, we want everyone to be able to self-actualize by meeting their basic needs. But how do they self-actualize if they can't leave the house because they haven't got period products?
Yeah.
And they have to be at home for a whole week every month.
Yeah. And talking about not having access to period products, another topic that we talk about a lot is period poverty. And again, I know that is something that is an issue and shows up differently in different parts of the world, but also in local communities. I know, here in our community, I quite often see these collections for people to drop off period products, and where they collect them for people who can't afford them. But period reality obviously is a lot more complex than just people not having access to products, right? I mean, it's not having access to toilets, underwear, clean water, safe disposal, or even education falls under period poverty as well. And I remember we did some work with a charity in Nigeria. They told me a story about how the community that we were going in to deliver a workshop, they'd also partnered with a product provider, and they came in with lots of products, but the girls didn't have any underwear.
Wow.
So they would show up at school in their school uniform, but they had nowhere, like they were wearing these dresses, but they had nowhere to put the pad in. So I think as we are talking about raising awareness and increasing that level of empathy, I think it's also important to think about the very well-intended but sometimes ineffective aid. Sometimes these solutions are designed without the local context. And I think that's what I meant with that hyper-localization as well. You for as an outsider, you can't.
It's so important, isn't it?
Assess that.
It's so important. And I don't think we realize it until you're there and you're in the environment and it happens, and then you realize, oh gosh, yes, actually, you can't.
Well, or even before that, acknowledge that you're not the person.
You're not
designing.
No. And I think that's it. But until these experiences happened, we didn't know. So it almost had to happen for us to then step back and say, hang on, why are we designing this?
Yeah.
Why aren't we, the collaborators or the allowing people the space to design it? And it's almost, I suppose.
But I mean, that's a trend over time, though. White people coming in thinking they have all the solutions without actually working with local communities about what is actually working really well. And just thinking better. So I'm very happy to see that in the work I do in the social sector, I'm seeing more and more of that human designed approach and these the need, the urgency to work in that way and collaborate with people on the ground to make sure that they design the processes and the needs. But it's, it's a long-standing practice that has shown up in many different ways and forms that we're trying to break here, isn't it? Or break through. A similar example we actually had once when we talked to a company who provides menstrual cups. And they also shared that often in like conflict areas, for example, there is a huge need for menstrual products. And there was another company, not the one I was talking to, who'd actually shipped boxes and boxes and boxes of menstrual cups to this conflict area and without any education on how to use them. So obviously, especially inserting products is different depending on context and religion and culture. With no education, that can actually be quite dangerous, but with no running and clean water as well.
Wow.
So it's well intended.
It's well intended, but absolutely.
But again, it's then actually harmful because if people start to use it, not knowing how to use it, how often to change it, not being able to clean it properly.
Not being able to clean it properly, then that is, absolutely. That's not safe, is it? So you're creating you're hoping for a solution that's actually creating more problems
and more of a risk.
And speaking of cups, actually, that's probably closer to home than we realize. There's a founder of a really fantastic organization, and her name's Elaine Goldstone. I'll have to look her up actually and let her know about this episode because menstrual cups are really close to her heart. Because of that exact situation. So actually, it's the same for women here in the sense that if you use a menstrual cup in a public toilet, where do you clean it? So you're either going to come out of the toilet and, that's a whole other conversation, or what do you do with it inside the toilet?
And then you're probably going to be waiting until it's quiet and everyone has left.
And everyone has left, and then for you to go out, and then you've got to go back into the toilet. And what are you using whilst you're out there? And then so she's creating solutions for that, and I just thought, and it's things that you don't even pause to think about, even in this environment. We're saying, well, actually, that's because now we're discovering more and more about other problems with using sanitary towels and tampons, and actually the chemicals that are in them, and risks they pose to our health. So we're asking for take all these chemicals out of these products. And so then we say, well, please, Percy, please. Yes, exactly.
Such a ridiculous request, but please can you take those?
Exactly. And then we're saying, well, here's an alternative that's, meant to be cleaner, as in, we're hoping it's not going to leach all these chemicals into your body, but actually you've got nowhere to clean it. And it's going to be unhygienic for you.
Well, and what I like about that is that, we often look at it as like menstrual health affects everything, right? It's not just our health and then education and then the workplace. It's actually a design issue or challenge for us as a society. And I think that's a great example of it. Like in the actual architecture of our buildings, how do we design our streets, our communities, our buildings, are to actually be built around every single human being. And that gets me really excited. And I'm no architect by any means, but I have had conversations with both businesses and schools even who said, what are the, we're building an extra wing to our school, like what should we be considering? And if they are thinking about these things, they might come up with like a special period pot where it's like a separate room with some bean bags and, some products, some hot water bottles where girls can go in and retract. And then when you have these conversations, like if you are building toilets, these might be things that you want to consider. Because it's not just a menstrual cup, it's just being able to wash your hands.
To being able to wash your hands
and have a proper bin and be able to sit comfortably on the toilet and use the bin at the same time without the bin poking in your, in your thigh. So it's those things,
having enough space to change if you need to. But no, I think that's really exciting. Well, it goes back to that blue skies. We talked about it. I can't remember.
I know. When if we are going to settle on the moon.
Yeah. How would we design our buildings? And there's so many layers. If you think again, it goes back to that. Yes, how would you design the space for menstruation? But how would you design it for circadian health? How would you design it for? And it is taking a blue skies approach all over again. And we've got that opportunity. It is hard to flip into that thinking. If you think about the buildings that exist at the moment, it's hard to step out fully from what we know. But I think it's the challenge. That's the exciting bit.
And even as people who have a menstrual cycle, that's hard, because we talked about how difficult it is to sometimes acknowledge what's going on for you and then translate that into a need you might have on a personal level, right? So to take the systems that we're all part of and almost challenge everything. Of actually,
and take it
could we optimize this? Depending, based on what I know now and based on what we know now as a collective, is this still what I would be doing, or is this still how we would be building it? And you're right, it's really hard because there's so much that we don't question because it's just always been that way.
That's how it's been. And it's not even that we don't question it because we're there's something stopping us. It's because we don't even think to question it.
Yeah.
Because we just make that assumption as a baseline. And I think maybe that's the challenge is, do we need working groups to consider, local community working groups when a new building is being planned? Like you say, when you're building a school wing, do we need to invite, layers of the community to kind of talk about that in a different type of consultation to what we have now? Because if you think about it now, I don't know what it's like for you, but our council, for example, will send a letter to say, there's going to be there's a period of consultation. Please write your comments.
Yeah.
But a lot of these explorations come in conversations. Certainly for me, the possibilities come when I hear other people talk and they say, oh, yes, well, but what about this? Whereas if I'm sitting in a room on my own thinking, well, what would my suggestions to the council be? I probably won't come up with very much. So, yeah, maybe it's an invitation.
And to your point earlier, it's hard. So if we don't get to educate people first about this being a thing and you might need
yes, exactly,
a sink in your toilet cubicle, then that's not something they're going to bring up either. So first, we need to get every single person to listen to our podcast.
Excellent.
And then
that's a noble motive.
No, but I like that. I like the idea of working groups and, just taking it as an invitation for all of us to. What I like, so some of the feedback of my trainings has been that of people saying, I walked away and then suddenly started to challenge everything, because obviously in the training we mentioned a couple of examples. If you might notice how you're showing up differently when you're the center of attention. Sometimes you might be fine. Sometimes you might feel very uncomfortable, or your skin might change throughout the cycle. And then people go away and say, my taste in music is different. Sometimes I like a good beat. Sometimes I like, so they just start questioning things they've never. And I love that because it's with that, through that lens of curiosity of actually why do I do the things I do, and why do I like the things
brilliant.
I like? And
that's brilliant.
It's cool, isn't it?
My husband came in 3 days ago, and I can't remember what I said. And then he looked at me and said, "Is it because you're luteal?" And I sort of looked at him and thought, and even though this has been sort of something that I've lived with all my life, this whole idea of tracking has been there for a long time for me, I realized it probably I haven't been as public or intentional in talking about it in my environment. But now, because of the podcast, it has expanded to him. So even he's kind of conscious, well, I'm just kind of keeping an eye on what...
How do you feel though when he says that?
I actually like it.
Yeah,
I like it because then he then feels that he's more conscious of, what might be happening for me and how then he shows up in that space. So I enjoyed the question, and I like the fact that he was curious about it.
And I think that's what we want, isn't it? To open up those conversations, because I know some women or people with menstrual cycles might be offended when someone goes, oh, and I think it's obviously the intent behind it. If you ask oh, you're probably going on, that's not great feedback. But
I think it's also, the historical context of women always being called hormonal, right?
Yeah.
And it's remembering, thinking about the origins of the word
Hysterical, yeah.
and all of that is the connotations that come with it that we carry. So we're always careful about if someone calls you hormonal, I suppose the new word would be, are you luteal? and then you're quickly looking, hang on a minute.
How is this landing?
What is the intention here? But if someone's intention isn't to minimize the experience, it's just to acknowledge and take part in it, then I think that.
And to be honest, my husband said this after he listened to episode 1 and 2. He's like, I learned so much. And I'm like, what? He's like, I learned so much. And I'm like, you've just lived with me for 5 years, listening to me going on and on and on about this every day. We now share an office as well. And you're still learning from episode. I'm saying you're in for a wild ride, my friend, when we go to the further episodes. But and he came up with ideas of what is actually doing an episode for people without a menstrual cycle and partners and supporters of what they need to know, but also in terms of how to support and how that support can be received and opening up these conversations. So it was opened up some great chats in our household even. So
Brilliant.
Yeah. Just on the topic of these unsafe products that we're using and on the theme of period poverty, there's obviously a lot of places in the world where people use all kinds of things as pads, right? Yeah. And I think in the previous episode, I mentioned of just stuffing some toilet paper in my pants at some point. But there's obviously all kinds of rags, newspapers, leaves, things people use. And one of the stories that really stayed with me, this was actually my time of Will Merit, was around girls and women using cloths in this community. I believe it was in Ghana. And these cloths weren't meant to be seen in public. So what very often happened is that they would use them, try and clean them, but then they couldn't really put them out to dry anywhere.
Gosh.
So you would put them somewhere in a corner, maybe in
where they'd go a bit moldy.
And then they don't dry properly and they might go a little bit moldy and then you have to use them again.
Which is harmful to you as well. Oh, wow.
And I think sometimes when we hear those stories of people getting creative is really what it is. And it's in horrible circumstances, but where people look for any type of solution, is that we tend to think, oh, that must be so uncomfortable, that must be, but we don't always consider the health risks as well.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, and I think that's major, isn't it, in terms of thinking about the health risks, because there's the easy ones of, using a menstrual cup that isn't cleaned, and that's straightforward, isn't it? You're now putting a cup in that's not clean, you're increasing your risk of infection. But actually, it's this, you're thinking about it. It doesn't immediately come to mind, does it? Because you've cleaned this cloth. But actually, if you put it somewhere where it doesn't dry properly and it becomes moldy, that's equally risky to your health. And in terms of the risks, risks of developing an infection, that could then be systemic and harm you. In fact, potentially kill you if it's severe. Is also
and not being picked upon,
and not being picked up on. Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's the thing about women is also, isn't it, in terms of powering through and how many responsibilities they have that they carry around. That means that there is a risk of missing symptoms that have come from that mean that you're not well, that you should seek support.
Especially when we don't talk about it.
And especially when we don't talk about it. And especially also when you may not have access to health, to health support nearby. You may not have access to a hospital or to a doctor nearby. So, yeah, absolutely.
And what you said earlier about we're standing on the shoulder of giants, I think we sometimes use that in many different situations. But what I like about your example is it's also women coming together, right?
Yeah.
And it's that community of we all share this common rhythm, and everyone is unique.
Yeah.
And everyone has their own experiences and their own context and but we all share this common rhythm, and to be able to gather around that and even start to have the conversations in those circles, I think is really powerful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, we did what we needed to do. So I think it's probably clear I'm a feminist.
Oh.
I know, I thought it might surprise you. And I think we did what we needed to do in terms of entering the workplace and sort of maybe accepting certain layers that we had to do in terms of power through
and quote unquote lean in
and all of that. Exactly, all of that. And I don't say it was a bad thing. I think for its time it was necessary because we were pushing certain ceilings that were not glass, they were concrete. And so that was needed. But I think now the collective power we have as women is in coming together to support each other and say, actually, I'm not going to throw away the bits that we bring to the table that are so powerful. And we're going to embrace all of our individuality. We don't have to be one thing. We can be lots of different things. We don't have to throw away nurture. We don't have to throw away the masculine layers that we have. We don't have to throw
and
any of it.
sacrifice so much of ourselves and our personal lives in the process of doing so, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. All of it is acceptable. We don't have to be a certain way, but we can support each other. And there's certain commonalities that we have and certain layers that we have, the biggest one being that rhythm that we get given, that we generally share. And even if we don't share it, there are, what you talk about, the stories we are in. What I mean by don't share it is there's biological realities, where there are women who don't have a cycle or don't have the hormones that mean that they will have that cycle. But there are that layer of storytelling experience that they have as girls growing up that mean that we are still united in that experience, whether biologically you're different or not.
Yeah.
And so we can still come together powerful. And, we can still show up in all those spaces where we were told, oh, no, you can only show up in this way. Well, no, we can just say no now. And we're going to show up in our way, and that's okay. And I think it's going to be amazing in 50 years when we can really do that. I'm hoping it's not 50 years, actually. Let's do it in 20.
Yeah, let's do it quicker. And I like that idea. Like, because I'm such a visual person, I really like the practice, I guess, of physically gathering around a fireplace.
Yes,
right?
I love that.
Especially in a storytelling context. Yeah. And I know I've shared that before about the menopause, where I was challenged on this idea of like the Western world got it all wrong because you dismiss women right when they're going through that transition of what in certain communities would be seen as becoming the elder.
Becoming the wise woman.
Right? And people gather around her and want to learn from her and her stories and her experiences, and how in our, from a Western perspective, but a humanity perspective, when that happened and when the men were out hunting and the women gather around the fireplace, also the power that women held from an influence perspective of being able to gather and discuss and talk and learn, and then being able to also influence the man in what is next. Right? And I think we kind of somehow obviously evolved into making sure that men in a lot of cases have more decision-making power. But that element of, there's this great story about Michelle Obama. It came up on my Instagram the other day, where Michelle Barack Obama went to a restaurant, and apparently the chef was her ex-boyfriend. And then Barack said, hey, Michelle, if you would have stayed with him, you would have now been the co-owner of this restaurant. And she said, no, if I'd married him, he'd be the president of the United States.
Absolutely. I loved it. I loved it. And it's and I believe it. I genuinely believe it. I agree with her. Yeah. But speaking to the point that you made just before, about, and I'd love to do an episode about menopause, actually, because I just really want us to shift that narrative. There's just such a negative narrative in the media about it. But there's so much evidence that suggests that actually that whole concept, sort of from an evolutionary point of view, is that those wise women were needed because they kept the tribe together. And so whereas they often stayed back a little bit and held the younger children, whilst the women, so particularly when they were moving forward, then they were traveling to new lands, the younger women were able to kind of run ahead, and the older women were the ones kind of that were able to kind of stay back, hold on to the younger children who couldn't go as fast, and provide wisdom that they had gained moving forward. And what was interesting, there's something, I don't know, we talk about longevity medicine, and it's quite a newer sort of branch of medicine, which is fascinating. And one of the factors around longevity is something called grip strength, and how strong you have to be. And I don't know if you've come across, people talking about us needing to lift weights and, be at the gym, lifting our heavy weights.
Is that like a rhetorical question? Like, you talk to me about that every single week.
I do. You do need to lift weights. But what is fascinating is this is what they did. So these grandmothers, or these postmenopausal women, not all were grandmothers, would be the ones pulling out roots from the ground, and that's part of the way that they fed the tribe. And they were carrying heavy weights continuously, because they were carrying these babies when the younger women were out there gathering, herbs and things. So they were doing those things organically. And we just need to recapture the power of that. You don't become defunct because you're now menopausal. You're entering your power, really, because you now no longer have those direct caring responsibilities that younger women have. So you can bring...
And naturally, you probably would... That would almost be like a magnet, right? Like you'd feel like you want to be close to those people and learn from...
Absolutely.
Learn from them.
And there's societies that still have that to an extent, right? The Japanese really revere older, the matriarch of the family, who's now kind of transitioned from the menopause, is way beyond that. And what is really fascinating is they don't experience menopausal symptoms in the way that women in the West do. And to me, that goes back to that storytelling piece as well that we were talking about earlier, is that experience influences biology so significantly. And they're bidirectional again, aren't they? So yeah, absolutely.
I love that. On the topic of gender equality, or gender equity, as we like to talk about it, one of the really powerful stories that we've come across is that there are communities around the world where girls they don't go to school when they're on their periods for various different reasons. So whether that being that they don't have access to products, whether the example we've just mentioned in Nepal, there was an example from a girl in India as well, of a girl who were being kept in a goat shed for a week, a month, missing out on school, obviously feeding into a gender inequality or inequity. Yeah. And then there was an indigenous community in California where girls are also being kept from going to school when they're on their period because they're being seen as divine. Wow. So actually during that week, they're being catered for, they're being celebrated, and it was just fascinating to me to learn from that, both are missing school. And so there's a lot to say about you're missing out on, what the boys are getting and the girls aren't getting. And there's a lot to say about that. But obviously the intent and the reason behind why they were missing school is so different because one is exclusion and one is reverence, what you were saying before. And I thought, that is such a powerful example of the differences in experience.
I mean, I'd quite like that as an adult woman. To be for a week, a month, we'd be taken away into my own
you shared that story, didn't you? Of
enriched and treated really well. Yes, and I couldn't find it actually. There was a mountainous village, and I wonder whether it was Nepal, but actually in this village, it wasn't treated in the same way. Women were it was a documentary I watched, and women willingly went into a space that was reserved for them. Once a month, whenever they were on their period. So invariably at any point in time, there were a few women that were staying in this one place, and then the men cooked for them whilst they were there. But interestingly, they didn't present it as impurity, even though I feel like it was near Nepal, but I obviously in Nepal it's treated as because they're ostracized because they're impure. But this
in certain communities.
In certain communities. But yeah, in this community it wasn't like that. It was more that they would just take themselves off to.
And we've had we've received stories like similar to that of communities where it might not have been the men cooking, but just the women looking after each other. So they basically took kind of turns that whenever you were bleeding, you
just
I was going to say, is it like excused yourself or you were excluded? Depending on how you look at it.
It's hard to know what.
But that was the time that other people cared for you.
Yeah.
And, when you came out of that, you were able to then care for others who were in a similar, who are
And
going
there's a lot to be said for that, isn't it?
I mean, just in general, that we can look after each other a little bit
But
better.
no, but there's a lot to be said for that, because if you can advocate for yourself as needing care. Because that's the other thing, is sometimes we have expectations of others who don't know what we need, and being able to ask for that and ask for what we need makes a difference, and say, look, it's that time that actually I could do with.
Well, so transitioning a little bit into how policies and laws can actually support some of these conversations, because it's obviously people expressing what they need, but it's also a lot of people can experience a lot of shame or embarrassment around that, right? If you can't afford products and you go to school, and so one example I wanted to highlight is that in Scotland was the first country in the world to make period products available for free. So there was the law that actually said everyone who is in need of products should be able to access them through public buildings. So whether it was like a library or any building that
fantastic.
People could access, and it had to happen, and this was in their wording, in a dignified way. So there were either products. The examples I know is either products in toilets, so you just have the privacy of your own cubicle, or at reception, or when you walk in that you can ask for it. In certain settings, there were like posters and communication around the building that said you could ask for, and then had made up with like a code word, so you could go up to the desk and say, "Hey, is Mariana here?" And then they would bring you some products. I was in Scotland in the summer of 2022, and I believe they just launched an app or a feature where you could see, if you open a map, you could see all the dots of all the places where products were available. And I actually went into a couple as well, just to kind of see what that looked like. And they're all in like, brown little bags, very subtle. You can take it where you go. And now you can see that there's many conversations happening in other places around the world that they're looking at Scotland of like, it's the first results are mind-blowing and amazing. And that won't surprise probably any of us that it's a good thing to do for society to do that. But I think it's really removing even some of the critical voices of people who always say, well, all the products will be stolen and people will empty you out and people will, and it's the evidence just continues to pour in that no one is going to take more than they need. So if they take a lot, it's probably what they need, or they might need it for others. And you will always have people who do that, but it's not going to outweigh the positives.
That's such a fantastic example of where we need to go. I think that's brilliant.
Yeah.
So there are more countries now that have done the same.
Not that I'm aware of, but don't pin me down on that. I do know that there's a lot of people who are looking at Scotland, and I think people might be waiting for that, for some of those official reports or whatever they come out. I do know that a report has already come out. I might be able to put it in the show notes. It was the Period Product Free Provision Act. And it said
fantastic.
Free access to menstrual product in public institutions such as school, universities and community spaces. The law places a legal duty on public bodies to ensure that anyone who needs products can obtain them free of charge in a way that protects dignity.
That's amazing. That is really amazing. Well, isn't it? Yeah, and I think you're right. I suppose in closing this, it would be that ultimately we can share individual stories. We can even share collective community stories. But ultimately, you also need the support of systems and policies in place to actually allow and empower those communities to take action. To improve things.
And for people to see how there's more steps and there's ripples. So you providing free products is not just helping the person who needs the product with an immediate need. it's then everything else that follows
with that.
of people then feeling confident, less worried, less stressed, more
Exactly.
empowered, more agency, more. So how it will impact their overall health, and therefore the cost on the
Exactly.
NHS and the cost for their workplace. And I think sometimes intentionally, obviously, systems are designed to not create full equity or equality. But sometimes it's also because we don't have these conversations.
Yeah.
People have never had to put themselves in someone else's shoes. And I remember when I started, I just started thinking about setting up Period Reality, and I came across a blog of a trans man. And it was, I kind of pride myself in the fact that I've worked in the social space for a long time. I've heard a lot of stories, and I always feel like I have a lot of empathy for people with different realities. And I started reading that blog, and it just, I sobbed all the way through, but I couldn't let it go afterwards as well, because it was an experience that I had never thought about, and I'd never put myself in a position of someone who's born in a different body than themselves. But actually then what that means is that you are a
In
man
their
with a monthly
day-to-day
period.
yeah.
And even when we do talk about it, it's not the whole podcast exists to say it's not a monthly period. It's every day you're impacted by your hormones.
Yeah.
And it's a constant reminder of having
Yeah.
that in your body
That
when
in
that
your-
doesn't feel
right
yours.
for you, yeah.
And I think, just to your point of like the importance of having the systems to back you up, but also for people to understand that this is a thing,
Yeah.
and what that means on that individual level, and of the experience of people who already feel excluded. And back to dignity as well, being able to access products no matter what you
to
look
be
like.
able to access products
no
in
matter
a private
what you,
space, right? Because you're now having to use spaces where periods are not a thing, right? Because you're now having to go into male toilets, which are not, if female toilets are not geared up for periods, how much less so are male toilets geared up for periods, and what that feels like for you, the lack of safety that creates for you going into that space.
100%.
And how to navigate that. And, and that's it. It goes back to that storytelling piece, is that because we cannot be in every person's experience. We cannot understand every person's experience when we haven't heard it.
Yeah.
And or even empathize with every person's experience. And that goes back to the importance of hearing those stories.
Yeah. Yeah, stories. These were, I think, a couple of really important examples of that intersection of like biology and culture. And I think what we are trying to do in these episodes is weaving those two together as well,
Completely.
right? That's the whole reason why we came together. And we often refer to it as it's the science and storytelling, but this is really what that means.
Yeah, it is. And I think for me, they're not actually that separate, because when a patient sits in front of you, well, in front of me, in clinic, their health is the sum of their biology and their stories. Because actually, your story of how you are living your life and the things that have informed your life directly influences your biology, and vice versa. So they're not separate. And we have done a really good job of separating it all. But if you're genuinely going to look at a whole person, and that's why I always go on and on about, taking a whole body approach to fertility, and taking a whole body approach to health, is exactly that you cannot dissociate, oh, this is where your experience stops, or this is where that story of stress and trauma stops, and this is where we start with the medical biology. They're not separate things, So I love that we're really kind of reinforcing that in our stories here.
Yeah, I like that. I was going to ask you a final question.
Go on.
Before we wrap up. I've got two actually, so now I have to pick one.
Yes, pick one.
Because the other one I'm going to save for another episode, I think. What was the first message you personally received about periods, and how did that shape the way that you saw your body and your cycle?
That's so interesting that you asked me that, because I was talking about this with my friend that we were discussing that experience with. I don't actually think we talked about it. I don't have particular memories of having a detailed conversation. Certainly at home, that didn't happen. At school, I remember a mortifying conversation, that biology lesson with the biology teacher, and she was more embarrassed
were
than we
the
were.
boys and the girls separate?
No, we were all together. So
Okay.
the boys laughed.
That was
the
a shock
entire
when I
time.
moved to the UK. Well, when I started this work, and I found out that that's still how they teach it here in the UK. So in the Netherlands, we were all together, and it was still very basic, but I don't think it was as little as here in the UK. But the fact that they still take the boys and girls separately
really. I mean, I've grown up. I'm from Cyprus, so I don't know. Yeah, my own experience of what goes on in the UK is actually from my patients. So my sort of pediatric patients and the teenage girls I look after who tell me what they've been told. But yeah, I don't think we had much, even though we were together. It was pretty poor. But then I had horrendous periods as a teenager. And so I really relate to that experience of, like I really resonated when you told me about the last time about the boy giving his cardigan to a girl. And I just thought that is just lovely. Like I would have appreciated that so much as a teenager. But it really wasn't something that we talked about. It was, here you are. You're going to need pads every month now.
And on that note, we've had, there was a story from an indigenous community in Mexico, and I was lucky enough to interview the two midwives in that community. And they were the midwives because they basically had babies themselves, so that, you're the most experienced one.
Yeah.
And one of them shared a story that the interviewer, the blog piece is on our website, actually. It's still one of the most fascinating things I've ever, I feel so lucky that I was able to chat with them. And she told me that when she had her first period, her grandmother thought, and this is like whether she'd either killed someone because there was blood in her bed, or that she had sex. And it's like, as a woman who clearly had a menstrual cycle because you had a child who had a child,
another child,
how would you even put that thought in her mind that she could have killed someone and that's why there's blood in her bed?
That's a really strange thing to go to as a first
thought. She was kind of giggling about it now in hindsight of like, isn't that strange of like even your own grandmother?
But like of all the things that could have potentially happened before you killed someone.
Fair enough. I do agree that is
like you could have cut yourself. Someone else
are you okay?
Cut their finger. Someone, yes, are you okay? Did you fall and break your leg and have a laceration? There's a lot of
all the
possibilities before killing someone. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. But I think we are gonna, it might not be an episode in season 2 because I feel like we filled those episodes, but the idea of like first periods and puberty. And I know you and I have had conversations where we've been dreaming up taking bits and pieces from different cultures and traditions around, when girls are going through transitioning and having their first period, but when boys hit a certain age as well, like how do we gather in community with them to celebrate that and do that? And I'm excited to
delve into
talk a little bit,
more. And look at stories also again,
from different.
And I'd love to have teenagers tell us what their experience is.
Yeah, absolutely.
In different communities.
I know there's been some teenagers from the Netherlands who've already been listening in English and they loved it. So
fantastic.
That's exciting. In closing, I think we've kind of established that menstruation is universal. But that dignity isn't distributed evenly. And that culture shapes our experiences as much as biology does.
Biology, absolutely.
And I think the good thing is, though, that if culture created this stigma and taboo, then culture can change it.
It's in our hands to make it different.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good way to close.
Hopeful.
Yeah, really hopeful. So more in our next episode.
See you then.
See you.
Thank you for joining us for Not Designed for the Grind. We love sharing this space with you.
If today's episode resonated, please subscribe and share it with someone who would appreciate a deeper dive into her cycle.
You'll find show notes and further resources at periodreality.org. And as your energy builds, consider starting something you've been putting off. This is a good phase to get something off the ground.
And remember, understanding your cycle isn't optional knowledge. It's the key to leading your best life.
Until next time. If you would like to reach out to the Not Designed for the Grind team or want to tell us your story, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at podcast@periodreality.org or follow us on Instagram at periodrealityofficial. You can also connect with us directly on Instagram at the.delphi.clinic and at Marlou Cornelissen, or find us on LinkedIn under Dr. Katarina Bambang and Marlou Cornelissen. If you'd like more resources, show notes and updates, visit periodreality.org/podcast. If someone came to mind while you were listening, send them this episode. And if you believe in what we're building, the simplest way to support us is to follow the show on Spotify or subscribe on Apple Podcasts. Ratings and reviews really do help more people find us, and 5-star reviews go a long way. A big thank you to all of you listeners, and please remember, the only thing that is true is what is true for you. Not Designed for the Grind is a podcast by Period Reality. The show is produced by Isabella Lindahl, created and hosted by Dr. Katarina Bambang and myself, Marlou Cornelissen. Audio editing and mixing by Delilah Odima, and our visual branding is developed by Millie Mensa. A special thank you to Favor Asueleman and the incredible team at Period Reality. We'll see you next time.